Images of murderers, madmen, premature burials, and mysterious women who come back from the dead appear in their heads. Just as the bizarre characters in his stories have captured the imaginations of many, so is Poe himself, who is often seen as a morbid, mysterious figure who lurks in the shadows of moonlight cemeteries or crumbling castles. This is just a legend and fabricated by an enemy trying to defame him. Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts, to two parents who were both traveling actors. Unfortunately, his father left the family early in Poe's life, and his mother died when he was just 3 years old. He was raised as a foster child by John and Frances Allan. Poe was never close to John, but did form a bond with Frances. At the age of 13, Poe was already writing poetry on the back of some of Allan's business papers. Money was always an issue between Poe and Allan. Poe went to the University of Virginia at the age of 13, but was unable to continue and forced to go back home because he wasn't given enough funds from Allan to cover his costs. In order to cover the difference, Poe had to turn to gambling and ended up in debt. When he came back home, he found out that his fiancée, Sarah Elmira Roster, had gotten engaged to another man. He was heartbroken and frustrated, so he moved to Boston where he published his first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, in 1827. He also joined the army at this time. 2 years later, Frances died from tuberculosis. He and Allan were able to briefly make peace, and Allan helped Poe to get into the United States military at West Point. Before Poe went to West Point, he published another book, Al-Arab Tamerlane and Minor Poems. Poe was eventually kicked out of West Point for not handling his duties. Poe and Allan were also fighting because Allan had remarried without telling him, and many have assumed that Poe got kicked out of West Point in order to spite him. After he left West Point, Poe focused on writing full-time. He traveled around New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Richmond looking for opportunities. In 1834, John Allan died, leaving nothing to Poe in his will, but leaving an illegitimate child that Poe never met. Poe struggled and lived in poverty until one of his short stories, Mrs. Found in a Bottle, won a contest in the Baltimore Saturday Vista. He continued to publish more short stories until he got an editorial position with the Southern Literary Messenger in 1835, where he was known as a cutthroat critic who wrote vicious reviews of his contemporaries. Poe had a love interest at the time who was his young cousin Virginia, who also became his literary inspiration. The two married in 1836 when she was only 13 years old. He also published some of his own works in the magazine, including 2 parts of his own novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. His tenure at the magazine was short-lived, however, because of his critiquing style and combative personality. He left in 1837. His alcoholism also played a part in his departure, according to some reports. Poe did some brief stints at the Burton Gentleman magazine, Graham's magazine, and the Broadway Journal. Poe always struggled financially, yet he was a popular writer with a lot of success. He advocated for higher pay for writers and an international copyright law. In the late 1830s, Poe published Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, a collection of stories which contain spine-tingling thrillers such as The Fall of the House of Usher, which tells the story of a sick brother and sister who, well, you'll have to read it to find out, but it includes a lot of blood. There are many theories from critics to explain the major action of the tale. A couple of other popular works that Poe published were The Pit and the Pendulum in 1842, and it was published in the literary annual The Gift, a Christmas and New Year's present for 1843. It takes place during the Spanish Inquisition, and the narrator is being sentenced to a painful, horrible, torturous death. The agony of my soul found vent in one loud, long, and final scream of despair. Poe published a short story called The Black Cat in 1843, that was published in the Saturday Evening Post. In this story, a murderer conceals his crime and then eventually breaks down and reveals himself after being plagued with guilt. The story is similar to The Telltale Heart that was written in 1846. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. In 1845, Poe published The Raven, which made him a literary sensation. The Raven is considered a great American literary work and one of the best in Poe's career. In this poem, Poe explored some of the common themes of death and loss. A narrator that is unknown mourns the loss of his great love, Leonore. The Raven is very well known, and many recall parts of the poem when it is heard. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there was a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the black December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Due to the success of The Raven, Poe was famous enough to draw large crowds and demand better pay for his works. He was also able to run his own magazine that he bought from the owners of the Broadway Journal. The failure of his venture, along with the deteriorating health of his wife and rumors that he was having an affair with a married woman, drove him out of the city in 1846. He moved to a tiny cottage in the country, where Virginia died at the age of 24. Poe was devastated, unable to write for months. His critics assumed that he would soon be dead. He ended up spending a lot of time traveling, giving lectures, and finding backers for his magazine, The Stylus. While on lecture tour, he befriended Nancy Richmond, but she was married, so he had a platonic love for her. He got engaged to his poetress, Sarah Helen Whitman, but the engagement ended after a month. Later on, he found out that his fiancée, Sarah Elmira Roster Shelton, was a widow, so he began to court her again. Before he left to Richmond on a trip, he considered himself to be engaged to her, and letters from the time imply that she felt the same way. On his way to Philadelphia, he stopped in Boston and disappeared for 5 days. He found in the barroom of a public house that was being used as a polling place. He spent the rest of his days at Washington College Hospital surrounded by strangers, since he was far from home. Neither his mother-in-law nor his fiancée knew what had happened to him until they read it in the newspapers. Poe died on October 7, 1849, at the age of 40. The exact cause of Poe's death remains a mystery. Days after Poe's death, his literary rival, Rufus Griswold, wrote a libellous obituary of the author in an attempt for revenge against some of the things Poe had said and written about him. He was written as though he was a drunken, womanizing madman with no morals or friends. It was meant to cause the public to dismiss Poe's works, but instead it did the opposite and drove the sales of Poe's works higher than that of his lifetime. This distorted image has made Poe a legend, and Griswold is only known, if he is known at all, as Poe's first biographer.